here with Vocab Malone. We're going to talk about Hebrew Israelites, something that I don't know anything about. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But thanks for coming on Capturing Christianity. Hey, take about like 50, 60 seconds and just tell our audience a little about you, what you do. You're a big guy on YouTube, so just tell them what you do.
Born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. Been in Phoenix, Arizona for a little while. And I do urban apologetics. It's kind of the specialty area I'm in.
Yeah, so tell me about like what is urban apologetics? How would you define that?
It's culturally contextual. So people influenced by sort of the core of the city, which is more and more people nowadays. It can mean different ethnicities. It can mean different groups of people. The key, though, is sort of the issues that arise in the city. So like in New York City, there's religious movements that start that sometimes are peculiar to New York, but they often spread out to the Eastern Corridor and eventually the rest of the country and sometimes the world, such as the group we're talking about. It literally did that. Started in Harlem, was Northeast for a while, Midwest. Now it's overtaking the Bible Belt. And then, of course, you mentioned social media stuff. So my main platform is YouTube. And I
do a lot of stuff with David Wood.
Do a lot of stuff with David Wood on Acts 17 Apologetics. We do satire. That's not the only thing we do, but that's what people will remember a lot. And then on my channel, I do a lot of live streams. So I try to really interact with the audience. I do abnormal things like freestyle in the middle of a show to kind of break up the monotony, stuff like that.
You've done some debates too, right? What's your like favorite debate that you've done?
My favorite debate was with Shadid Lewis. So he's a relatively well-known Islamic apologist. And really interesting guy, always prepared with the notes. And it was cool because instead of just the Christian having to defend the position, which is common in Islamic Christian dialogue, I defended the New Testament, and then he had to defend the Quran. So we did back-to-back debates. They're both, I think, 2 hours. So a lot of substance, and he was kind of lighthearted. So even though there's a lot of content, the debates were fun.
Cool. Okay. So it's actually interesting because on our way over here, our Uber driver was a Muslim. And so what was your like approach in that debate? How would you enter into a conversation with a Muslim and try to share something quick with them? What would be your like quick pitch? Such
a disconnect between sort of the average Muslim and a Muslim apologist that it depends who you're dealing with, right? But when you're talking about sort of the more learned Muslim, there's still a lot they don't know about their own sources. And
by their own sources, you're talking about obviously the Quran and also
the Hadith literature, right? Even the biographical literature of Muhammad. There's just a lot that they haven't seen. And in a way, who can blame them? We're talking a vast amount of data, a vast amount of data. Granted, a lot of it repeats itself. So Sahih Muslim repeats Sahih Bukhari and vice versa a lot. But we're talking a lot of information. But the thing is, it's really important, Cameron, because no one really reads the Quran and just can read the Quran because there's no context given in the Quran. There's no chronological narrative. Half the time you don't know why a ruling is given. If you don't understand the background, you don't really understand what Muhammad is talking about a lot of times in the Quran because there's no context given. So
and I also understand that like each surah kind of like jumps around to different topics like very quickly.
Yeah. It can get it's pretty challenging. It's pretty challenging to look at. And so you'll see
Muslims look at that as like this is an indication that this is God doing this, or that God has given us this literature because of the way that it's written. And so it's sort of evidence in their minds that Islam is true.
They point to things like the beauty of the Quran in Arabic. And even the Quran issues a challenge. It says, produce a surah like unto it, saying nobody could write anything this great. Even that's not a great argument because you could say, look at what Shakespeare did with the English language, produce a sonnet like unto it. But it doesn't equal divine transmission. It doesn't equal veracity. It doesn't equal any of that.
I've heard of actually a book that was written in the style of Quran. Are you familiar with it?
The True Furqan, I think, is one of them. I think there's another one as well.
Yeah, and they presented it, I think, to Muslims, and they didn't know which one was which.
Yeah, there's a couple I know of, and from what I understand, they're really well done. I think you can appreciate them more if you know Arabic, of course.
Yeah, well, let's not get too far deep into that subject. We're going to talk today about Hebrew Israelites, and I encourage you to pick up this book if you're interested in the Hebrew Israelite, which we're going to learn about today, the whole movement, and kind of a brief response to it, what it is. We're going to do an overview first, and then we'll get your response and how we should start to address them. So tell me what it is. Like, you already told me that it originated in Harlem and then it kind of spread. Now it's in the Bible Belt. But tell me what it actually is.
Hebrew Israelism is the ideology, two key components to the general ideology. Then I'm going to will it down to my specific area within the larger umbrella of that movement.
Okay.
The two key components are people who are thought to be African descendants in the Western Hemisphere are actually the true Israelites spoken of in the Bible. Point one. Point two, lineage of all peoples has important salvific implications. It matters, and you're standing before God who your dad was.
Okay.
That's what that means, the second point.
Okay.
So that's Hebrew Israelism as a broad idea. But then...
So would that exclude like someone like me who has no African heritage? Well, not any recent African heritage.
Two things. One is they don't actually think they're African. It's so-called African.
Okay.
So they think there's African peoples who are Hamitic, and they think, these are Hebrew Israelites I'm speaking of, that they are Semitic because they happen to live in Africa as a result of the dispersion of Israel, but they themselves are not Hamitic. They're Semitic. And so they would say so-called African or thought to be African or something like that. And that's why that's why I worded it in a certain kind of way. So it depends. So if we whittle it down and focus on the group I focus on, it's called One West Hebrew Israelism. We can get into why it's called that, but to answer your question fastly, they by and large do exclude someone like you, but not just people of European descent. They would exclude Arabs, who they call Ishmaelites. They would exclude Asians, who they would call Moabites and Ammonites. They would also exclude Indians, who they would call Elamites, as in East Indians. But the type of Hebrew Israelites I deal with would include Hispanic folks and Native Americans as well on their 12 tribes chart, which indicates to them who are the elect ethnicities in God's sight.
So how do they arrive at these beliefs? How did it all happen? Was there just like one guy who started to teach this and other people picked up on it? How did that happen?
The 1880s are the first time we see someone say, hey, so-called African Americans are actually descendants of Jacob. F.S. Cherry, after that, William Crowdy, then it's sort of lost who did what, when, where, why. But by 1919, a very important congregation in Harlem began called the Commandment Keepers. And you can tell, obviously, by the name, got an important and a focus for these folks on keeping Torah as they would see it. Out of that congregation, about 50 years later, 1969, a new school began, which would go through several name changes, but we'll just call them for now the Israelite School of Torah or Tanakh, began by Abba Bivens. These peculiarities I mentioned about identifying certain people groups with certain ancient biblical peoples in the modern era that make corollaries, Abba Bivens seemed to start most of that, from what we can gather. It's a little unclear with some of these lines because a lot of this is based on oral history. But Abba Bivens began the kind of Hebrew Israelism that I focus on, which is the most militant and mysterious, but also has the most momentum out of all the sects. Okay,
so this is still, I guess, help me connect the dots. So remind me of what the two things are that they believe that sort of separates them. It almost sounds like they just identify as Jews.
Yeah.
Or like the true Jewish people.
Yeah. So
it almost sounds like they're rejecting Christianity, like it's Jesus as the Messiah, and like and Paul's message about it applies to everyone.
So a few things. Within Hebrew Israelism, there are Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelites who it almost looks like Black Judaism. But that's not the One West type that I focus on, the guys on the street.
Okay.
That kind says we accept the New Testament.
Okay.
We accept Christ, and most of them would say we accept Paul. What they say is the Christian church, which is influenced by Roman Catholic theology, does not properly understand Paul. That's what most of them would say.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that they say that we get wrong or that Christians get wrong about?
Well, okay,
Paul?
This one's going to be hard to stomach because it's really absurd in a way.
Okay.
Whenever Paul or the New Testament in general, so the book of Acts written by Luke, for example, mentions Gentiles in a favorable context, those are not actually ethnic Gentiles. Those are lost Israelites who've been scattered in a Gentile state of mind.
Okay, interesting.
So that way
So
Cornelius.
then it would only apply to the Black Israelites.
Yes.
Or to the Hebrew Israelites.
Yeah, they generally don't like the term black in front of it. They view it as racist, although that's anachronistic, or it's retconning, I'll say that instead, because in their own history, they used to call themselves Black Israelites. But more and more, they actually view it as racist. So I just say Hebrew Israelites, usually with quotation marks, because it's a contentious phrase or idea. But they add Hispanics and Native Americans. And so, yeah, that way it's only to them. So Cornelius, for example, Acts chapter 10, clearly not an ethnic Israelite by every indication in the text of the Italian band, everything about him. If you read the text, it's obvious to any person reading the text, he's not an Israelite. But because he's also accepted by God and he's shown favor by the God of Israel, they have to turn him into an Israelite. So they just say he was an Israelite. And the way they do that
not
is
by ethnicity or
no,
genetics.
by ethnicity, no, by genetics.
Interesting.
What they do is they go to other, what they call precepts. So they say precept essentially is a proof text for them.
Okay.
So they jump to other places to show salvation is only for Israel. And then by a logical deduction or whatever, well, therefore, Cornelius.
Since this person is accepted or saved,
exactly,
then they have
you
to
got
be.
it. So it's backwards in that way.
Yeah.
And of course, as a quick critique, there is a word for what they're talking about. A scattered Israelite in a so-called Gentile state of mind, although the Bible wouldn't say it that way. It's called a Hellenized Jew. They're spoken of in the situation that arose in the early church where there's a problem with the food distribution amongst the widows. The Hellenized folks, these are Jews who adopted Greek culture and customs, were getting less food than the less Hellenized ones. I'm saying it in a manner of speaking, but you can read about this. So there is a word for what they're saying, but it's not the word. It's not Gentile. It's not the word they use. And so it really makes the Bible unclear because it's like, okay,
who does it apply to?
How do you determine which one's which? Basically, here's the answer. If the text is favorable to the group being spoken of, those Gentiles are scattered Israelites in a Gentile state of mind. If the text is not favorable, then those are actual Gentiles.
Okay. So what's the point of all of this, though? Like, what are they trying to get at? They're trying to say that some people are saved and some people aren't saved?
Some people are not even candidates for salvation.
Okay.
Based upon ethnicity.
Okay.
And that's just how God set it up. So you kind of said the point. It's like this. If your ancestors were slaves, it sort of doesn't feel very noble to basically have your history start with slavery. And so that's kind of the way things have been portrayed or how they're perceived. This jumps past that and gives people a grand history that is actually in the Bible, which it's sort of an upend because the Bible for a long time has been the most important book within Western civilization.
Yeah.
And what this ends up doing is saying, hey, you people in Western civilization that have hated us and mistreated us during the transatlantic slave trade, the book you cherish is actually all about us. And so it gives folks really an imaginary community, an imagined history, but the most important thing that it gives adherents is an imagined identity. And identity formation and completion are very important. And so when people look at this and they say, no one should take that serious, you can never discount the power of identity formation and completion. And so the intellectual scaffolding supporting the idea is almost secondary to protect this newfound identity that a person feels they have. That feels better than identifying as a Christian because Christianity is viewed as sort of a European bastardized version of the real biblical message. So Hebrew Israelism is similar to Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons in that it's a restorationist movement of sorts.
Okay, so I've identified at least two different claims that they're making. The first one is theological. They're talking about the Gentiles are sort of excluded from the pool or from the possibility of salvation.
Yeah.
But then also there's this empirical claim that the Hebrew Israelites, or this group, however you want to identify them, are descended from the line of Jacob, right? And that seems like an empirical thing that we could kind of look at ancestry and figure out. So how do you go about addressing those two different claims?
Excellent. So you did hit it on the key points right there. So the theological one, when you look at scripture, you don't only look to the New Covenant or the New Testament, because there's counterexamples of their theology all throughout the Old Covenant or Old Testament as well. For example, there's a man named Caleb who was with Joshua, one of the only two out of the spies who was able to go into the land. He's a Kenizzite. And later on, he's described being part of Judah because they would sort of put him into a tribe. But my point is, Kenizzites are not part of the tribes of Israel. They're a different nation. You have Uriah the Hittite. And the list could go on and on. It could also go over to the women. Ruth.
Melchizedek also.
Moabite, yeah. So even people before Israel also. So sometimes they'll say to me, so which gate are you going to enter for your salvation? They're referring to the end of the book of Revelation where it speaks about the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's a gate there and all this. And sometimes they'll say, okay, great question. Which gate is Noah going to enter into? So Noah's before Abraham. He's not part of Israel because there's no Israel yet. Sometimes they'll say, well, he's a proto-Israelite. And this group I'm talking about that I deal with, they believe in reincarnation. So they would believe Noah actually showed up later on anyway.
Wow.
Again, to reiterate, these are the One West type Hebrew Israelites. If someone who's a not One West, which these are the Hebrew Israelites descended out of a certain address, that's where the One West comes from, in Harlem, they might watch this and say, Vocab is giving an inaccurate representation of some of my beliefs because I'm not speaking about the fullness of their beliefs. Now, the two main points of Hebrew Israelism I mentioned in the beginning would still apply to them, because even though they think Gentiles can be grafted in, there's still an ethnic hierarchy within their ecclesiastical structure. But I'm focusing in on the One West type of groups. So the second thing.
The empirical question.
Right. They, by and large, discount DNA evidence. Unless it's convenient to their position, they think it's friendly towards it, they usually discount it. So if I ever mention DNA
it sounds
evidence,
just like confirmation bias, just on the face of it.
Yeah, sometimes they'll say things like this, well, most of the big testing companies are owned by Jews, and they're trying to hide the truth from us because they're ethnic and religious imposters.
That's interesting, because I thought the ancestry companies were actually owned by the Mormons.
Mormons own a lot of them. They're incorrect. Yeah. The companies are not all owned by Jews. It's not even accurate.
Okay.
But and sometimes they'll say, well, it's still a new science, and they're figuring out things and all that. Some are a little more crass. They'll say, well, that's white man science. Every now and then you run into a Hebrew Israelite who says, well, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, and look, here's my chart, it is confirmed that I'm Semitic. Sometimes you get those guys. But here's the truth of the matter. The exception proves the rule, and here's what I mean by that. South Africa and Zimbabwe is home to a group of people called the Limba. The Limba, especially within the male priestly clan, have demonstrated not only through their oral history, but by genetic testing, to have DNA that can be traced back to the Levant, meaning Semitic, meaning highly likely their ancestors were Israelites. And interestingly enough, most of them are Christian as far as their religious practice these days. A few things about that. They're not where the transatlantic slave trade happened. That's the West Coast. That's the Ivory Coast. It's a different area of the continent of Africa. So it's irrelevant really to any kind of claim. And it's a small people group within the continent itself. So it's not impossible through the dispersion. You could have people who would display similar phenotypical traits as other Africans to actually have Semitic ancestry. That's not impossible. But the question is, does that equal the equivalency thesis that they have, which is if you came over here on a ship in accordance with Deuteronomy 28:68, then you're actually an Israelite. It doesn't. It doesn't equal that. It's irrelevant to it. But by and large, they discount DNA.
So how much of this do you cover in the book? Do you cover all of the things that we've talked about?
Not
today?
all, but a lot.
Okay. So, well, again, we're going to have to cut this interview short today, but if you want to learn more about the Black Hebrew, yeah, you got it right here, the Black Hebrew Israelites.
I put it on the title so people know what I'm talking about, but in the book, I call them just Hebrew Israelites. But
okay.
It's on the title.
If you want to learn more about this and how Vocab responds to this, pick up his book. I've got it in the description of the video. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about this before we close out?
To Christians watching this, if you know a Hebrew Israelite, which you're going to meet one. They're not just out on the corners. They're at your job more and more. They're in your family. It's going to, I think within 5 years, it's going to rival and surpass the Nation of Islam as the largest competitor in the city for the Christian church. I think that's almost certain. So you're going to meet them.
So you're saying take it seriously, right?
Yes, I am saying take it seriously. And I'm also saying ask them what they believe. Find out what they believe. because everything I've said, it's highly idiosyncratic. And so I'm describing a large swath of it, but I'm not describing everybody. So ask them what they believe, find out what they believe, go with them. But also, I would do serious evangelism. What I mean by that is, this thing, what I've seen when someone adopts this identity thesis, because if that's all they adopted, Cameron, it's actually not that big of a deal. It's like, okay, you might be mistaken. It's not the end of the world. But what it does is acts as an anchor to their theology. And all of a sudden you get works-based salvation. All of a sudden you get denigration of the deity of the Christ. All of a sudden you get denial of the Trinity. All of a sudden you get acceptance of the Apocrypha. I'm not saying that's as bad as the others, but all these other things that weigh down the theology and transmorph it into something that I think Galatians directly spoke against.
Wow, that's been really interesting. So, well, thanks for coming on to Capturing Christianity. I'm sure we'll do something in the future, maybe host a debate between you and a Hebrew Israelite. That might be interesting.
That would be very interesting.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, man.